The year was 1776, and the air of the American colonies trembled with both fear and anticipation. Across 13 colonies stretched a restless murmur, whispers of rebellion, of liberty, of a new world being born. The dawn that would one day be called the spirit of 1776 began not in grand halls, but in the hearts of ordinary men and women who dared to believe that freedom was worth everything, even their lives. In the small town of Lexington, Massachusetts, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer echoed through the cold air as Samuel Whitmore shaped metal into musket barrels. His face was lined with age and soot, but his hands never trembled. Beside him, his son Jacob worked quietly, his eyes burning with the same determination that ran in his father's veins. "Pa," Jacob said, looking up from the barrel he was polishing, "do you really think we can win against the king's army?" Samuel didn't look up. "Winning isn't the question, boy. The question is whether a man can live his life bowing to a king who doesn't even know his name." Outside, a horse galloped down the dirt road. The rider shouted, "The redcoats are marching to Concord. They mean to seize our weapons." Samuel dropped his hammer, his face hardening. "Then we'll meet them before they do." That night, as fires burned in chimneys across the countryside, the call to arms spread like wildfire. Farmers, blacksmiths, and teachers picked up muskets and powder horns. They were not soldiers, they were fathers, sons, and dreamers, bound together by a single, unspoken truth. They had had enough. When dawn broke over Lexington Green on April 19, 1775, the world changed. The mist hung low, and on the horizon appeared the gleam of red. The king's soldiers, disciplined and deadly. Facing them stood the ragged militia, no uniforms, no flags, just men trembling not from fear but from the weight of destiny. A single shot rang out and no one knew who fired it, but that shot became the echo heard round the world. Muskets blazed, smoke filled the field, and when it cleared, bodies lay still upon the grass. Among them were farmers who had never left their fields before that day. The revolution had begun. Months turned into years, and what began as rebellion grew into an idea too powerful to contain. In Philadelphia, in a stuffy hall filled with the scent of ink and wax, 56 men gathered to put their defiance into words. Thomas Jefferson, only 33, sat by the window with his quill trembling in his hand as he wrote the words that would change the course of history. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." When he finished, he read it aloud to the others. Silence followed, heavy, reverent. Benjamin Franklin smiled faintly, his old eyes gleaming. "Gentlemen," he said, "we must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." Outside, the heat pressed down like judgment, but inside that room, something greater than heat burned, a conviction. When they finally signed their names on July 4, 1776, each man knew the cost. They were signing their death warrants if the war was lost, but they also knew they were signing the birth certificate of a nation. While Philadelphia celebrated, the war raged on. George Washington, a tall, solemn man with eyes that carried both burden and belief, led his ragged army through winters that froze hope itself. At Valley Forge, snow fell thick and cruel, and men wrapped their bleeding feet in rags. Hunger gnawed their bellies, disease stalked their camps, and yet they did not surrender. At night, Washington walked among his soldiers, silent. One evening, he knelt in the snow, away from the camp, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. "God," he whispered, "if this cause be just, then strengthen my hand, but if it be not, then take this burden from me." No answer came in words, but when he rose, the stars above seemed brighter, as though heaven itself had chosen to watch. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, King George III paced in fury. "They will crawl back," he said. "They are children rebelling against their father." But the colonies were no longer children. They were men and women who had tested defiance and found it sweet. Back in Massachusetts, Jacob Whitmore had joined Washington's army. His father, Samuel, too old to fight, worked night and day making weapons for the cause. Every nail, every barrel, every spark of metal was a piece of his heart sent to the battlefield. Letters from Jacob came rarely. "We are cold, Pa," one read, "but we are free in our hearts." Samuel would read those words aloud to his neighbors, his voice trembling with pride. In 1777, news came from Saratoga, a victory. The British Army, once thought invincible, had surrendered. The air in the colonies shifted. Hope was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. France, inspired by the Americans' courage, joined their fight, sending ships and soldiers. The tide had turned, yet the war was far from over. For every victory, there was a valley of loss. Entire towns burned, families torn apart, brothers fighting on opposite sides. The revolution demanded everything. In 1781, on the fields of Yorktown, the final chapter was written in gunpowder and smoke. The American army, alongside their French allies, surrounded the British forces under General Cornwallis. The thunder of cannons shook the ground. When the British finally lowered their flags, the war was done. Jacob Whitmore stood among the weary ranks, his uniform tattered, his hands black with powder. As the British drums beat their slow march of surrender, he thought of his father, of the forge, of that first morning at Lexington. He whispered, "Pa, we did it." Back home, Samuel waited by the hearth, the fire crackling low. A knock came at the door, and when he opened it, there stood Jacob, a older, thinner, but alive. They embraced without words, tears cutting paths through soot and ash. That night, under the same stars Washington had prayed beneath, the bells rang across every colony. From New Hampshire to Georgia, the cry went up, "Freedom!" But freedom was not a gift, it was a wound and a promise, a one that would take generations to heal and keep. Years later, in 1787, as the new nation tried to build itself, debates raged again. What did liberty mean? Who was included? And all men are created equal. The answers were uncertain, but the spirit of 1776 say that fierce belief in self-determination burned on. Benjamin Franklin, old and frail, left the Constitutional Convention one afternoon. A woman stopped him and asked, "Dr. Franklin, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" He smiled faintly. "A republic," he said, "if you can keep it." That phrase echoed for centuries to come. Jacob married, built his own forge, and taught his son the same lesson his father had given him. Freedom, he would say, is not given once and kept forever. It must be reforged every generation. And so, the spirit lived on through wars, through struggles, through triumphs and mistakes. It lived in every protester who demanded justice, in every soldier who stood guard at midnight, in every citizen who voted with hope. It lived in the music that filled taverns and churches, in the ink of newspapers that dared to question power, and in the quiet prayers of mothers who sent their sons to defend a dream larger than themselves. 200 years later, in 1976, America celebrated its bicentennial. The streets were lined with flags, the air filled with fireworks and song. Old men who had fought in more recent wars watched with tears in their eyes. Children waved sparklers, not fully understanding that the light they held in their hands was a reflection of one lit long ago by those who refused to kneel. In Philadelphia, where it had all begun, the Liberty Belay cracked but unbroken stood as a reminder. Tourists passed by, some in silence, some whispering. An old veteran stood before it, his hand trembling as he touched the glass. "Still ringing," he murmured. "After all these years, it's still ringing." The spirit of 1776 was never just about the war. It was about belief that ordinary people could shape their own destiny, that truth and justice could rise above power, and that freedom, once kindled, could light the world. Back then, they had no guarantees. They had no map for what would come after. They only had courage, the kind that doesn't roar but stands firm when everything seems lost. That courage became the foundation upon which a nation was built. A nation imperfect, but ever striving. A nation born not of bloodlines, but of ideals. And though centuries passed, though generations rose and fell, that same spirit remained in every act of conscience, in every voice that said no to tyranny, and yes to hope. The birth of a nation is not a single moment in time. It is a heartbeat that never stops, a torch passed from hand to hand. The spirit of 1776 was not buried with its founders. It breathes still, in every person who believes that freedom is worth the fight. On a quiet night, if you stand beneath the stars that once guided Washington's army and listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of that first musket shot, not as a sound of war, but as a call to remember that liberty is fragile, that courage is costly, and that the promise made in 1776 was not a conclusion, but a beginning. And as long as there are hearts that beat for justice, as long as there are voices that rise for equality, the spirit born in that fiery year will never die. It will live on in the dreams of every child, in the resolve of every citizen, and in the soul of a nation forever chasing the light it once dared to create. For that is the true legacy of 1776, not merely independence, but the eternal courage to seek what is right, to build anew when the old fails, and to believe, always, in the power of the people to shape their own destiny. That, and that alone, is the spirit of 1776.